Good morning to some, good afternoon, good evening to others. I'm the Executive Director of the World Press Institute, and I'm just starting the introductions here. As many of you know, the World Press Institute is a US-based private nonprofit organization, and for nearly 60 years, we've had a US fellowship program in the United States where we brought 600 international journalists for a 2 to 3 month fellowship program. We now have over 600 alumni journalists. I want to, before we get going here, thank a couple of our partners in this presentation. I first want to thank the America for Bulgaria Foundation, who really was the idea for this. We have a conference that we had to postpone because of the COVID pandemic. And we hope to have that conference now in September of this coming year. But the America for Bulgaria Foundation suggested we do this webinar series, and they've been supporting us in part, and I thank them for that. In addition, we've had some great cooperation by the Association for European Journalists in Bulgaria, who've helped publicize things. So thank you too to them for their involvement and help with these webinars. First of all, we're going to have two speakers today, Dr. Joan Donovan from the Harvard Kennedy School and Andras Petho from Direkt36 in Hungary. They will each make opening remarks, and then Michael Montgomery, who is with the Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting, will come on to moderate questions and answers. If you are interested in tweeting, we do have a hashtag for this, a hashtag WPI Disinformation webinar. And feel free to use that. Now, just briefly, I'm going to introduce the speakers, and I'm also going to ask them to say a few more words at the beginning of their presentations. But first of all, we have Dr. Joan Donovan, who is a research director of the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She is really a leader in the field of online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. She received her PhD from the University of California in San Diego and had a postdoctorate fellowship at UCLA, also in California, Institute for Society and Genetics. Andras Petho is the co-founder and editor of Direkt36, an investigative journalism center in Budapest, Hungary. He was previously a senior editor at the Hungarian news site Rigo. He's worked for the BBC, shortly for the Washington Post, and several other organizations. He's contributed to a number of international reporting projects, such as the Panama Papers, and has had several prestigious fellowships, including most recently the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University, a Humphrey Fellowship at the University of Maryland, and probably most important, the WPI Fellowship in 2008. Michael Montgomery, our moderator, is a senior reporter and producer for Reveal at the Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco. He had out of college, had a Fulbright Fellowship in Eastern Europe, worked for a number of news organizations, including the Daily Telegraph, Los Angeles Times while he was in Eastern Europe, and has also worked for CBS 60 Minutes, and he is a WPI board member. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our first speaker, Dr. Joan Donovan, and let her talk for a while. Once she's done, we'll have Andras talk for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open this up to questions. So, Dr. Donovan?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been studying over the last decade is this thing we call the internet. And it's led me down some very strange paths as a sociologist. But one of the greatest joys of my job at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard Kennedy School is working with journalists and talking with journalists. And of course, our fearless director is Nancy Gibbs, formerly of Time, who has taught me a lot about what it means to be a journalist, what it means to comport oneself, to have values and ethics and epistemologies and ways of thinking about the world and approaches to getting the story that are different from just any old person deciding they want to do something, say something, write something online. Journalism as a profession has been destabilized, to say the least, by the internet. And at the same time, I think it's introduced a whole new generation of people to what is really important about journalism, which is the separation of facts from everything else. And of course, that doesn't mean journalists are never wrong. We're all wrong at some point, myself included. But journalists really are, as the saying goes, the first draft of history. And what could go wrong, of course, with being the first draft of history? Well, a lot. Some of it has to do with mistakes that anybody could make. But what I've really tried to study in the last several years of my career is the impact of people who try to get journalists to say the wrong thing. So these are people we would call media manipulators or disinformers, disinformation operators. And we've seen an uptick, of course, in campaigns beginning in 2016. Of course, there was the lots and lots of talk about what might be called fake news, thanks to Craig Silverman's both research and reporting. When he was talking about fake news back even in 2014, he wasn't talking about this political idea that you point the finger at CNN or MSNBC or Fox and say, oh, that's fake news. What he was really pointing at was a phenomenon on the internet and within internet culture to mimic the look and feel of journalism, online news, in order to, offer up clickbait or to get some advertising click-throughs. And it was rather innocent in that stage, other than, theft of value. But what we saw through the politicization of fake news back then was that it was expedient to report things that are untrue for political gain. And we saw throughout 2016, 2017, lots of different players get in the mix. And one of the biggest problems we've been finding in this field isn't that, everybody else is out here doing their own thing, whether they call it news or something else shouldn't matter, but rather the distribution of news itself is what has been challenged significantly, of course, with the introduction of social media. And fast forward to now, where we're in 2021, we've just watched as the US has struggled through an election, did not have a peaceful transfer of power. This is not indicative of US politics in general, but is an outgrowth or a result of massive disinformation campaigns attacking the electoral process. And the other thing that we've seen that's really a problem throughout the globe is massive amounts of medical misinformation during the pandemic. And one of the things that challenges us about medical misinformation that's different from political disinformation is that a lot of people share it because they think, well, maybe my friends and family won't get this message. They share it just in case. They share it out of love. And that can be really tricky, especially in moments like we're going through today in the US, where the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been put on hold pending some review of some side effects. That is happening in a very public way. Usually 6 side effects, adverse event reports wouldn't halt the rollout of any drug, but because of the high profileness of the situation and the scrutiny on the governments for oversight, they're taking this tact. And what it's done is produced an opportunity for anti-vaccination activists as well as seekers of chaos to lob all kinds of misinformation into the public conversation, because we're all essentially using the same hashtags, using the same search terms, and using the same infrastructure to talk to one another, as well as to find our news, as well as to get updates from the government. That mishmash and that centralization of all of these channels is something that is going to imperil societies if we don't start to label and tag things for what they are, if we're not careful about who we're sharing information from. And the last remark I'll say about this is really about the way in which the press gets wrapped up in it, which is to say that in the pandemic, of course, good old boots on the ground, shoe leather reporting is tough to do. And you've had to develop an incredible amount of new sources because, frankly, COVID is everybody's beat now, no matter what it is that you're reporting on. You're reporting on online gaming, you're reporting on in the economy. Everything has a COVID dimension to it. But it's changed journalism in the sense that we're all really looking in the same places, both for good information and we're getting served bad information. One of the things that we've tried to do with our media manipulation casebook, I can put the link in the chat, it's mediamanipulation.org, is get journalists set up with some vocabulary around the tactics that manipulators use in order to get you to report the wrong story or to get you to report a story in a certain way. One of these case studies in particular that I'm thinking of has to do with cloaked science. So this basically scientific preprints that aren't just bad science, right? So a lot of things get up on preprint archives. They don't make a lot of sense and they're, jargony and you can't parse them one way or another. Or they're experiments that really weren't done very well and they don't have a lot of documentation and they're maybe not going to pass peer review. But what we're really talking about is the planting of papers that look like science, but are actually political disinformation. And so we did a parallel investigation with the Washington Post about this beginning late last year and into this year, where we looked at a case of cloaked science that involved Steve Bannon, as well as an exiled Chinese billionaire who was paying Steve Bannon to promote anti-China lies, essentially, in the US. And one of the things that Bannon was doing was going online on YouTube twice a day to quote unquote report the news. And one of his main storylines last year was about this young woman postdoc from a lab in Hong Kong that had fled Hong Kong and knew, according to her, for a fact that COVID was a Chinese bioweapon. Of course, that myth has pervaded discussions online for months and months and months and is a very comparable to other conspiracy sets of theories. This one is a very big one. But what he doesn't tell you is that he's the one that paid for this woman to fly and has been providing her a stipend and paid for a paper that was then put up on a scientific archive called Zenodo, which is run by CERN. And so he doesn't tell you how deep his hands are in the construction of this narrative. And so what we try to do as a team and as researchers over at the Shorenstein Center is give you a sense of that vocabulary, give you a very deep forensic look at how hoaxes, scams, grift, disinformation, media manipulation propagates across the net. And our hope is that over time, journalists will adapt to the situation that we're in and platform companies will realize hopefully what they've built, which is essentially in Siva Varadarathyan's terms, who wrote Anti-Social Media, it's a propaganda machine. But if we take the advice of and the research of someone like Sophia Noble, what we can look at is and look to understand is how the internet is not just a propaganda machine, but it's really at its base core, it's an advertising machine. It's meant to put advertising in front of people. And if we now start to think about social media differently, and if we start to think about the incentives, profit, and politics especially, I think we can come to some resolutions around what we might do about intentional disinformation and media manipulation for the years to come. And if we do nothing, of course, there's a cost as well. And the cost, of course, is our democracy and our public health. And journalists are on the front lines here. And so it is my pleasure that I get to collaborate with journalists worldwide on these issues.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's not an easy task to follow Dr. Donovan on this, but it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here and to contribute to WPI's webinar. As David mentioned, I was a fellow in 2008, which I think everybody agrees that was the greatest class in the history of WPI. I understand that, maybe I will be accused of disinformation here now, but this is what I believe, and I think I have some facts for it as well. Anyhow, so what I would like to talk about is Hungary as a kind of case study in disinformation, maybe a sort of special case in a situation where the main source of disinformation is the government. I mean, I know that's not a unique situation. There are many countries where that's the case, but I think it might be somewhat special in what you call like democratic countries or EU members, NATO member countries. So let me start with showing you two images. These are campaign posters from the government from the 2018 parliamentary elections in Hungary, which was the last general election here in Hungary. Here you can see two images. On the left, people marching. There's a big stop sign. It doesn't really require and didn't require in that campaign much explanation. The message was that migration has to be stopped, especially migration of people who are coming from Muslim countries or different from us. So that was the point of this poster. And the other one is you might recognize the person there. His name is George Soros. We call him Soros because he's a Hungarian-born American billionaire. And the poster said that let's not have Soros. We shouldn't let Soros have the last laugh. And the message of this was part of a larger campaign, and which was about the government was saying that George Soros is behind, has this master plan to bring in millions of migrants to Europe to change the electorate and build like a more left-wing liberal electorate in Europe to defeat conservatives and nationalists. And these two images were, this was basically these were the main messages of this campaign, and there was a problem with these that neither of them was true, or at least the underlying facts were twisted in such a way that they had no real connection to reality, and because the government built its whole campaign, 2008 election campaign, on the message of fighting migration, and was telling people that migration is a huge threat. And the truth was that Hungary didn't really have a migration problem, especially not in 2018. While during the 2015 European migration crisis, a lot of people entered Hungary through our southern border, but practically all of them left. Hungary has never really been an attractive destination for immigrants or refugees. I live here, I was born here, I think it's a great country, but it's a small and relatively poor country with a language that is beautiful, but it's almost impossible to learn. So those who came here, they went further, they went to Germany or the Scandinavian countries. So most Hungarians have never even met a single refugee or immigrant from that group, but the message still worked. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's party, the Fidesz party, won the 2018 elections by a landslide, and they secured another supermajority in the parliament. which allows them to do whatever they want, including rewriting the constitution or approve any kind of law. And how did they pull this off? With a massive propaganda infrastructure that they had built since they came to power in 2010. That's how they managed to make a big part of the population believe that this message was true. And they built this infrastructure in a very systematic way over the years, like over a decade. The first step was the public media, the takeover of the public media. As in most European countries, we have state-financed public media. This is mostly broadcast, radio, TV, newswire as well. And this is supposed to be independent and impartial, like the BBC. But while in Hungary, which is a relatively young democracy, in Hungary, the public media was never as independent and autonomous as like the BBC, but it had like some better periods. And what this current government did after 2010, they turned it into a mouthpiece. They didn't even maintain a pretense of impartiality or independence of its journalism. They forced out the best journalists and brought in their friends. And what was probably the smartest in a devilishly smart way, that they made the services of the state news agency free. So all these small news websites or local papers or radio stations that could not afford to subscribe to the news agency before, now they got access to it for free. And of course, this was a different news agency. Now it was spreading government propaganda. And this happened, this takeover took place in the 2010, 11, 12. So it happened relatively quickly. And then after that, what the government did was that they went after the private media. With the website I worked for, Origo, happened to be the first major target of this crackdown. What they did, that they started to put pressure on the owners of these private media companies. My news website was owned by a telecommunications company, which is, it's relatively easy to put pressure on a telecommunications company because of all the regulations and the state contracts. And then, the government also took advantage of the weakness of the media. Like, we know that you all know that the business model turned upside down, and the financial crisis hit the media industry especially hard. That was true in Hungary as well. So they took over some of they bought some of the outlets from these owners who wanted to leave Hungary anyhow. And when I'm talking about I don't mean Viktor Orban or the government. They didn't do this directly. They had their friends, businessmen with close political ties, and they did this. They were the ones who bought these news websites or TV stations, radio stations, and so in the last decade they literally bought all the local papers in Hungary outside Budapest. All the county papers are owned by the people close to the government, and they have one of the main TV channels, commercial TV channels as well, and lots of radio stations. And last year they managed to take the largest, most popular news website index under control as well. So by now the government has built a whole new media ecosystem, and they control hundreds of outlets. And they have, they also have all the money in the world that they can spend on social media, primarily on Facebook, which is the most widely used social media in Hungary. And if you look at their the coverage of these outlets, then you can see that it's very much orchestrated. Let me show you another another image. So that gives you an idea. This is some of the front pages of the local papers. You know, this man here is our Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán. So they interviewed him. I don't remember the interview exactly, but I'm pretty sure that it was a friendly interview. So, you know, they publish the same stories, they publish at the same time. And they often fabricate or, you know, make up stories or distort stories. Like when they interviewed people from Germany who said that they are afraid to go out to the streets because of the migrants who arrived in Germany. You know, what these pro-government outlets forgot to mention was that these people they interviewed were members of the far-right AfD party. But you know, the idea was to show that look at what's going on in Germany. We cannot let Hungary become something like that. Or, you know, they took videos, sometimes just randomly, of violent attacks, muggings, robberies that took place in other places, sometimes in the US, and they portrayed them as if they were committed by Muslim migrants in Europe, again with the same message to show like how bad the situation is in Germany or France or other countries. And actually the Hungarian pro-government media was also very active in promoting the lies that the US election was stolen, and you know, they kept referring to Joe Biden as a candidate, even after most American outlets, even Fox, I think, they reported that he had won the election. So, and these outlets also use the same language, the language of the government's spokespeople. So it really works like a political weapon, and that's what it is. It's a political weapon. It's not journalism anymore.
Thanks everyone for joining us. You know, we chose this topic, and obviously because it affects everyone around the globe. And so we wanted to tap into this network of alumni and people who are friends of WPI, because we thought this would be a very helpful topic. So yes, as David said, please, I encourage you to send your questions in the Q&A. Interesting if you're in other parts of the world, what you're seeing. You know, we constantly see stories about, shall I say, Facebook and other social media companies being far less aggressive, if you will, in policing posts and what have you in other languages. And that's not even suggesting they're that aggressive here. But I want to just start with a question for both of you, Andras and Dr. Donovan. Dr. Donovan, you talked about the media needing to label things for what they are. As you well know, there was a huge debate during the Trump administration about distinguishing between misinformation and disinformation, meaning intent. And the media, mainstream media, was very reluctant to use the word lie or lied, or the Trump administration lied. And they were in a very awkward, uncomfortable position with that. I'm just curious whether you think the mainstream media is doing a better job calling out outright disinformation. And Andras, same question for you. How is this playing out in Hungary when, how is the media or the independent media handling, you know, basically outright lies coming from the government or government controlled media?
Yeah, so, you know, a lie is a lie is a lie is a lie, no matter how pretty it's disguised. And the issue with the media, I think in print, especially in television, is liability, which is online. You can kind of say and do whatever you feel like, But if you do that in your column from the New York Times or WAPO, or even, you know, from the desk of Fox News, right, as Dominion is teaching them, you're going to get sued. And so calling someone a liar, a manipulator, a disinformer, it's actually a pretty high bar to reach. And so one of the things that my field as researchers are plagued by, and people are like, you should do rapid response. I'm like, well, journalists do rapid response. Our job is to kind of sit with the trouble and figure out, well, how did this happen? And how did this information, whether it's a lie or a kernel of truth with a lot of, you know, spin and context added, how does that reach millions of people? And this is the difference, which is to say that when we're talking about intentionality and we're talking about, for instance, in many instances, it was Trump's tweets, then you do have to do the fact checking. You do have to do the reporting, and you can't come out within the first 4 hours and say, usually, that we know that this is a lie, because the way in which this stuff is worded is really weaselly. You know, it's got these kernels of truth. It's half true. There's some nuance to be added. But then there's moments when it is just a lie, like Trump coming out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning saying, well, pretty much won this election, right? That kind of stuff you do got to call out, and you got to do it quickly, and you got to do it first. But yeah, there's just a different rule book for online communications. And of course, the Section 230 is one of the things that we talk a lot about. But I don't think that that's really going to matter too much in the coming years. What I think is really going to matter is that journalists find a way to distribute the news that doesn't rely so much on social media and doesn't rely on them being so heavily wedded to this very responsive and adaptive communication system, in which journalists, when they put out something that says, well, that's a lie, then there's a cascade of allegations, and then doxing happens, right? Then their families are put at risk. It's I can't say how tough it is out there for people who are engaging with disinformation, because it's almost like any journalist that engages with this is like stepping in quicksand, and the more you struggle with it, the more it's going to drag you down. And so the one thing that the journalists have really needed to do, and only have done as an exemplary job in the last year of post George Floyd uprisings, is calling things racist, right? Because it's one thing to call something a lie and have to balance the nuance, but we often will hedge around things that are racist, and we won't say it as such. And that is something that deeply hurts communities, because ultimately media should be representing a faithful argument about the situation that we're in. But I've noted over the last year that it's been very difficult for journalists not just to call something a lie, but also to call out racism when they see it.
Andras, what about you? I'm curious. I don't want to say you're on the front line. That's a terrible metaphor. But how does this play out for you and for other Hungarian journalists who are trying to, report responsibly and thoroughly?
Well, yeah. I mean, I need to go back a little bit more in time. Like when I started journalism, and when I got my first real journalism job, that was in the early 2000s, in 2002, and I remember that I was quite optimistic about journalism in Hungary, and I saw that there was a new generation, my generation, or maybe even people a bit older than me, who really wanted to do journalism differently from how it was practiced in the 90s and of course before the regime change. So we had the problem of breaking with these old socialist legacy, and unfortunately after 2010 when Orban, who is a right-wing politician, they came back to power, and they made it quite clear that they want to take on the media. The very first legislation that they introduced in 2010, it was about rewriting the whole legal framework of the media system in Hungary, and a lot of many parts of that legislation were really problematic. And then they started doing what I explained in my talk. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that the most of the independent media, or some of them, are quite left-leaning, critical with the government. I think they kind of assumed and accepted the role of opposition, or being the critical player here. Sometimes they even happily accepted the role of the victim, that we are the ones who are attacked by the government. And I think I'm afraid that with this approach, I tried to do things differently, but I'm not blameless here. Of course, that they played into the hands of the government, because they needed to antagonize the media, and they needed to portray the media as if you are they didn't use this phrase of enemy of the people, but it was basically the same idea. And so I think we lost some opportunities here, because I think that and I hope I'm not naive, but I think that there is a demand, and there is an appetite for truthful information. And I think that instead of turning against the government, we should have turned towards the public and the audience, however fragmented it is, I know. And we should have shown the value of our work, and we should have shown more fairness in our coverage. So, basically, when I'm not that optimistic anymore about our journalism. Some of the basic rules were abandoned. And I'm talking about the independent side of the media, that sometimes they don't even contact the people they are writing about, because they say that, well, they never answer. And yeah, I know that most of the times they don't answer, but sometimes they do. You still have to do your homework, I think. So yeah, so I hope it made some sense. It was not entirely different from the debates that went on in the US media, but it was there were some differences, because we have some different challenges and problems.
Thanks, Andras. We have a question. I want to circle back to this question in a minute about Mr. Soros. But I want to, Joan, you wrote a very interesting piece that sort of looked at how secondhand smoke impacted the way people looked at the harm caused by cigarettes. It wasn't just, individual choice to smoke, but you were impacting the lives of others. And of course, you were talking about COVID disinformation. It can't be clearer, in my view, that there is direct harm. And I want to ask you about the responsibility of social media companies. I mean, we could talk for a long time about this. You mentioned Section 230, which some people may not be familiar with. But I want to ask you the question in a way that won't force you to talk for a long time about this, because it's such a big topic. But where are we heading, do you think? You've talked about regulations. You've talked about these companies needing to be more transparent in how they go about countering disinformation. What do you think we're going to expect both in the US and possibly the EU in the next year or two, in terms of, will there be a real push to find ways to regulate in the way that, eventually governments went after tobacco companies?
Yeah, so the reason why I was kind of thinking in this framework is, in sociology, we think a lot about the origins of things. And when we think about the harms caused by smoking, it's not like a concept like secondhand smoke just existed in the world. And we were like, oh, that thing is a thing. No, it took years of research and epidemiologists, public health people, insurance people, uh, literally people rebuilding airplanes that had to accommodate for smoke. There were all of these different signs and all of these other industries involved in saying, well, there's something about this product that is causing other people lots and lots of pain. Lung cancer is obviously one of the biggest outcomes of it, but there's all kinds of other associated dangers and emphysema and whatnot that happens to people that are just within the proximity of people smoking. And so what we ended up with, though, were regulations about public space, not regulations necessarily about the product, although, of course, there are rules about filters and different kinds of properties of cigarettes and of course, now vaping. But what we got primarily in the US were you can't smoke in the doctor's office, you can't smoke at the movie theater, you can't smoke in the mall, and then it turned into, well, actually, if you're within the proximity of a doorway, you can't smoke over there, and you can't smoke here, and can't smoke in the public park, and can't smoke at the beach now. And so, slowly over time, you've seen the world adapt to this. When it comes to platform companies' products, right? Facebook is a product. Facebook isn't the internet. Twitter's not the internet. Even Google is not the internet, although Google Fios, with getting baked into hardware, we might end up starting to make a different argument about a company like that. And if Facebook gets into phones, then we might start to make a different argument about Facebook. But by and large, what we're talking about are products that amplify things. If you permit me, in Massachusetts, we love to mix our metaphors. So if you permit me one more metaphor, which is I like to think about Facebook and Twitter and YouTube like a boombox, and speech is the cassette tape or the CD you put inside. And so really the question becomes, how many people does this touch, right? This piece of misinformation. And so, the old adage of, that old meme of, can't go to bed tonight, honey, somebody's wrong on the internet. What happens when millions of people are wrong all at once? And if you can track it back to a single individual who just happens to be making money off of that claim, or just happens to be pushing this political agenda because it's expedient during this time of, whatever the breaking news is of the moment that they're piggybacking that disinformation into the news cycle on, then yeah, platform companies have a different responsibility. Some people like Karen Kornblue have called it a circuit breaker approach. I've talked about it as needing to kind of turn up the volume on timely, local, relevant, and accurate information while we try to turn down the volume on disinformation. But by and large, it's a problem of scale and openness, which is it's pretty easy to spin up a bunch of fake engagement, whether it's either by paying for advertising through the platform or paying for some kind of dark PR, or not dark PR. Many journalists end up becoming social media experts, right? Because you learn a lot about how information travels in the course of your work. But I say that all to get us to the point of saying that when millions of people believe a lie, it doesn't matter how much truth you try to introduce into the debunking or whatnot, because ultimately people have heard the lie, they understand the lie resonates with them. Soros in particular is someone that we've seen many different lies attach themselves to him because of his impact on the world. But in COVID times, it's been just as, we've seen just as much misinformation attach itself to Gates and even to Zuckerberg himself around the Chan Zuckerberg initiatives. And I bring that up just to say that there are different ways in which these lies are going to travel. and there's going to be different kinds of resonances. But when we talk about the collective resonance, that is who hears the lie and believes it, by and large, what we're looking at is people who are already either already believing certain conspiracy sets, or it resonates with them because it's anti-Semitic, or it's racist, or it's misogynist, and it confirms some beliefs that they have or some fears that they have about other kinds and types of people. This is why we have to get much sharper on combating hate speech and network harassment and incitement, especially after January 6th in the United States, because if you can convince enough people that the election has been rigged and their democracy is under threat, and you're the sitting president of the United States, you can trigger a violent insurrection. And you don't get to, we don't want to watch that happen twice. And the last comment I'll make is that there is something particular about the psychology of people in the US where I don't know why this happened the way it did, but when a shot gets fired in the Capitol, and there's not a bunch of other shooting that happens, that is like something that's only ever going to happen once, because they're going to come prepared next time for much more violence. But there is something unique about the psychology of that moment that I'm still struggling with as a researcher to understand why. And it could just be that our systems were not set up in place and in time where a centralized person was able to issue a text message to a bunch of people in that area to say, hey, shots fired in the Capitol, guns up. It could be very well that the next iteration of our technology allows for that kind of very instantaneous geolocated push alert. And so that's why we need to have some vision and regulation around our technology, because of the ways in which people who do seek to harm others are able to use this and wield it in ways that are not entirely predictable by the designers themselves.
Andras, we have several questions for you. One about, I'm just going to try to sum them up. One is about how George Soros plays into the scenario of misinformation, and also about the degree to which the Hungarian people trust the media. I think the reference is the government-controlled media, but also how has the media covered COVID in Hungary? And, I'm just looking at the question now. Has it been able to accurately report on COVID, or has it, I'm talking about government-controlled media, has it chosen to cover it accurately? Have you seen, kind of disinformation, misinformation on COVID coming through the government media? So a couple different questions there.
Yeah, so about George Soros, yeah, basically he was to some extent, he still is, but he was the target of this massive government campaign, and he was an easy and really in many ways like a perfect target. He had this connection to Hungary, so he was somewhat familiar to Hungarian people, but they didn't know him that much. And he wasn't really here to defend himself, and the government always denied that they had any that anti-Semitism played in any role in their campaign. But certainly a lot of people took it that way, because they, when these posters appeared on the streets, then often you could see like really, really ugly messages, anti-Semitic messages sprayed on them. So he was the boogeyman. He was the target of this campaign. And as for the how people view the media, I think, I already made this mistake that I was too optimistic 20 years ago, so I don't want to make that mistake again. But I think that in the last year, the conversation around the importance of the audience, the people's support for the independent media has become stronger. And I mentioned that there was this popular news website, Index, that was taken over by the government, and the whole staff resigned, and they launched a new website. It's called Telex, and they did basically a crowdfunding campaign, and that turned out to be the most successful journalism crowdfunding campaign ever in Hungary. They had like tens of thousands of subscribers, supporters. So, and our organization, Direkt36, we are a much smaller, we are an investigative reporting organization. We are also membership based, and we could also see that the number of supporters has gone up. So there is a little bit of hope out there. And
so I just want, do people ignore the state-controlled media? I mean, are they suspicious of it? You know, do they?
It's
given
very,
the history of the socialist era of government-controlled media.
So since Hungary is a very polarized country, like many other countries, like the US, so there are people who genuinely believe, and the government and the government's narrative, and they watch and read, follow these propaganda outlets, and there are those who, I guess, skeptical, and you can see that some of those outlets that were, when they were taken over and they became more propagandistic, then they lost some of the audience. You can see that, especially with with the online outlets. You can see the data, but even with the TV stations, like the most popular TV channel is still an independent TV channel, it's RTL. But it's more like, they have a good news program, but it's mainly an entertainment channel. So yeah, again, I don't want to be too optimistic. I still remember I was born before the regime change. I still remember when we only had the party media, and I remember that it was boring. Propaganda tends to be boring. So that's why I'm saying that I think there is a hunger for real stories and truthful information. And but there is this constant struggle, and the government really understands this. They really know that the biggest danger for them is accountability journalism and truthful reporting. So and that ties to the question about the COVID situation. So the government is really trying and is managing to control the information flow on the pandemic. We don't really have access to hospitals. Doctors are not allowed to talk to reporters. So most of the reporting, most of the coverage is based on leaks and anonymous sources, which is so actually a few days or maybe a week ago, a group of these independent outlets, they published an open letter to the government, and they requested access to the hospitals. And then the government's response was that, well, in the hospitals you should cure people and you shouldn't go there and make fake videos. That's what the Prime Minister said.
Doctors aren't allowed to talk to reporters?
They talk, but they are afraid of the repercussions if they give out, like, information that is not there is too
Yeah, in
sensitive.
the US, I would say too, most doctors don't like to talk to journalists, which is why we end up with a few doctors that are just very popular and very careful. But I've in my experience over the pandemic, lots of doctors have a lot of questions that they want to ask, but very few want to speak on camera or want to speak in public about what it is that they're experiencing. And part of it has to do with that they don't want to be in public seen as not really having a very close handle on the problem. And because the science around COVID-19 is very unsettled, right? We still have a lot to learn. But yeah, by and large, it's been interesting to hear doctors, surgeons, all kinds of people calling me up being like, you know what? I don't know what's going on with my patients, but they seem to think there's a microchip in this vaccine that we don't have. Why? Can you tell me what to tell them? And I'm like, hey, I got this itch. Can you tell me what to do? No, I'm kidding. But by and large, yeah, there's a big problem with doctors, public health officials. Even in the US, we've had numerous public health officials quit during the pandemic because of the overwhelming demands on their time and energy and on their fear of when you speak out in public, what's going to happen to you. Because we're not just dealing with folks that like have something to say on the internet. We're dealing with people who are so deluded by some of the things that they've bought into that they're willing to take action. That's what's so scary about the, for instance, the Soros conspiracies is he funds so much stuff in this world that anybody who is taking funding, a part of open society foundations, of which many people take funding from them at Harvard, and myself included. What's scary about it is the way in which it shows up in your worlds, right? Is that, activists, journalists, anybody who's taken funding or been part of a fellowship that was funded by Open Society then becomes a target for some of these folks who are incredibly relentless. I mean, I woke up this morning to a few different emails that were very alarming and alleged that because of some of the funding we use, or that we recently published a report on mitigating medical misinformation with the WHO, funding from the WHO, and of course taking that money then of course made me part of some global cabal trying to take down the government through population control, which was news to me, but nevertheless, that's where you end up.
We're going to, we got about 7 or 8 more minutes. There is a question about the EU and their announcement that they're going to step up efforts to fight online disinformation. I'm just reading from this question, and publish guidance to strengthen the code of practice on disinformation. The question is, what are your thoughts on the sort of self-regulatory approach? Code of conduct, code of practice. I'm not super familiar with the content of these this new effort from the EU, but there's this bigger question, self-regulation. You mentioned rule section 230 in the US. There's an ongoing debate about that. But basically, yeah, your view about self-regulation for the social media companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's like putting the kids in charge of recess. I mean, yeah, of course, everybody, all the time is free. Everything is free. Let's just keep going the way we're going. Yeah, sure, someone will eventually say something dumb, but let's just keep moving. We knew this was a problem back. I was reading through some medical journals in the late 90s, trying to get a sense of how doctors thought the internet, what they thought the internet might do for doctoring. And there was this great quote from a doctor in a very high status journal. It basically says, this is a disaster because people are going to be posting information online. They're not going to be trained. They're not going to know the differences between X, Y, and Z. And they're going to start diagnosing themselves. And here we are 20 years later, and there's some serious problems with the way we deliver information. The fact that all of the medical information that you might consume is wrapped up in The news that you're consuming is wrapped up in messages from politicians, is, you know, in the same timeline and newsfeed as your uncle's conspiracy postings and your nephew's bar mitzvah. I mean, you can't operate a information hub like that and not think a lot about the consequences. And especially now that we're not, it's, you know, you have to think about this moment as something that was a result of at least the last decade of social media companies scaling without a plan for what happens when someone like a Donald Trump comes in and knows a bit about marketing. He knows a bit about public conversation. You know, he knows a lot about media, and he's extremely popular. And so it's not like he needed to spend a ton of money to spread disinformation. He was using the networks that he already had. And companies are not people, they're entities that need to be governed, right? They're not, we are at best lucky that Zuckerberg is who he is and isn't Steve Bannon. But are we going to get to a point where a platform figures out how to do scale and how to cause the most damage to society in the pursuit of their political vision? When I think about the future of technology, I'm not thinking about these behemoths of Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. They're kind of like seen their moment, and eventually I don't think they're going to remain the way that they are. I think Facebook and Twitter are going to go into banking. I think YouTube is going to kind of amble on and then eventually become essentially a replacement for television, with, you know, these kind of like late night talk show type people that do a lot of damage in terms of the way they spread hate speech and propaganda. But it's not it's not something we haven't seen before, you know, with shock jock radio and whatnot. But I do worry the future of technology about someone like Bannon or other key figures that have learned a lot about what is possible because of their experiences with January 6th, and are now trying to shape technology to fit the next moment in which we're going to see some broad populist insurgency, essentially. And that is what I hope we can regulate this tech environment to guard against.
Thanks, Dr. Donovan. Andras, I'm going to give the final word to you. We're just a couple minutes away. I want you to embrace this optimism that you still have. What keeps you optimistic? What keeps you going given the situation in Hungary?
I truly believe that, you know, there is a need for these kind of stories, and there is a need for truthful information. I know that we are not going to go back, and probably we shouldn't go back to the old times when, you know, when you had like just a number of gatekeepers of information and news. I don't think that was, certainly in the case of Hungary, you know, I don't think that was good that, you know, we had like just a few newspapers or newspaper editors who decided the agenda of the public discourse. And now it's a lot messier. It's very noisy. I also think that if I look around, I see amazing journalism, even in Hungary and outside Hungary, in the US and other countries. Like, amazing journalism is produced. It's just that the distribution has become much messier, and yeah, we need to figure out a way to fix that. Is that optimistic enough?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andras, and thank you, Joan and Michael. It's been a really nice presentation on disinformation, and we appreciate that. We appreciate everybody else who tuned in. I want to thank once again our partners, the America for Bulgaria Foundation and the Association of European Journalists. Stay tuned for future WPI webinars. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.